Perfect. Well, I'm excited to be here. So first off, let me introduce myself. I'm Ashir. I lead up our talent acquisition, talent flex product areas, and I'm really excited to be joined today by Alan from Dolby. And so we're going to have a dynamic conversation talking about elastic talent and how not only looking at full-time employees, your full-time talent pools, but bringing in contingent makes a dramatic difference in your ability to sort of staff up and be ready for any situation when it comes to talent. So let Alan introduce himself.
Yeah, everybody, my name is Alan Kumar. It's not coming through. One more time, can you guys hear me? Interesting. All right, sorry about that. Hey everybody, my name is Alan Kumar, Elastic Talent Program Manager here at Dolby Laboratories. I oversee basically non-employee workforce, pretty much contingent labor, our MSP, outsourced technical projects from there. And previous to that, I was at a company called Upwork, which is an online talent marketplace, oversaw their contingent labor program, and prior to that was in the MSP space, working for Apple, and then also was a part of the VMS space, IQ Navigator. And just really excited to be partnering with Eightfold in Talent Flex and what we're doing here.
Yeah, so I'm gonna start it off with a little bit of a warm-up question, right? Just to get people to know you a little bit better.
Yeah.
So, originally I thought we could just do an exercise routine right here. Now that we got chairs, we're in good shape. So, let me ask you a question: are you a coffee or tea drinker? For the audience to know.
I'm definitely a coffee drinker. I think since 16 years old, I can't remember a day that I haven't started a day with coffee. I can't remember the last time I drank tea, actually. So, definitely a coffee person.
Well, that's good to hear. Anything specific about your black, cream and sugar? No.
I need creamer for sure. I definitely can't do straight black, but try to cut it down a bit. Not 4 cups a day anymore, so yeah.
So as I transition into sort of talking about the topic of today, right? Again, as I look at it, over the last year and a half, we've been on this journey with Dolby to really unpack the way that they think about talent. So let me start off by asking you the first question. Define elastic talent a little bit for this audience to learn.
So elastic talent pretty much is non-employee workforce. Anything that's outside of your full-time employees, it would be your contractors, your vendors, anything that is related to non-employee basically. And I can unpack a bit more. Why do we call it elastic is the ability to be able to scale up and down just because they're not your core full-time employees. They might not be with you for 7+ year stretches. It's one to be able to empower how to be able to scale up and down with folks that are not your full-time core employees.
So I think this is really important, right? And just by way of background, prior to Eightfold, I used to run a platform that essentially did the same thing, right? Gig Now, which was bringing in contract talent to help large organizations really staff up their needs. And one of the benefits I saw about this is, again, when COVID hit, we were able to scale back. When COVID came out, when people stopped worrying about those things, we were able to scale up. And so if I think about Daly's situation, right, what was the driver to come to Eightfold to really think about us helping you solve that problem?
Yeah, I think Eightfold was very interesting to me in that you guys were already embedded in our talent acquisition ecosystem. It was one where before I came into it, I didn't have a lot of exposure into the platform in itself, but as I was getting more experience into it, the AI benefits of it, and just more so that this is a new product that you guys are launching, I thought, okay, this would be very interesting to be able to see, is there something that we can do here from a direct sourcing standpoint to be able to leverage our own brand that we could really utilize Eightfold from there. So I think just it being a new product, also too, I did know your background, so that actually did help a bit as to why I would have some level of comfort in a new product into it. And then also just because it's one where a lot of these platforms like VMSs, they've been around for 20+ years. You can't change the engine while the car's driving, and it's one where it's like a really plug and play, you sort of take it, SaaS platform where it's one like, hey, we might actually have some potential to give some insights on the build.
I mean, fundamentally agree, right? Like, again, my thesis has been for the last few years is that, direct sourcing owns the space in the full-time space. And in Contingent, it has been really focused on using your supplier base to provide up talent. And the thing that's at times is great about that is that you have people that are sourcing for this, but most organizations don't control their destiny around this. And I think per our first conversations with you and Nick from Dolby was, how do I control my destiny around this? How do I improve quality? How do I improve my time to fill? And I think that's how some of this journey kicked off. Dolby is a well-recognized brand in the industry for wonderful sound quality, but how does that translate into talent and finding the right people to fill the roles?
Yeah, I think the big interesting point for us is that I fundamentally feel that recruiting is a very inefficient process. You might have 100 people, 100 candidates that apply, you pick one person. It's not to say that the other 99 were bad. And it's one where, you usually bring up a good example about GE and data, which I'll let you, say a little bit later. But it's one where it's like, if it's an inefficient process, how can we sort of re-leverage our brand and re-engage people? It's not to say that, hey, we found one great event planner. It's not to say that we couldn't use additional help at some point down the line. How can we be able to re-engage and rebrand into it? It's one where if you apply, you didn't get a job, you leave, have a bad taste in your mouth maybe about Dolby. But if you re-engage and if you can sort of look into like, hey, maybe we can redeploy or maybe look into other folks in a more gig capacity, it really helps the brand and it really helps to be able to, find a place for some of these silver medalists, these bronze medalists, because there's good talent out there that, we can't always hire for a full-time employee, but maybe there's an opportunity in a flex model.
Yeah, no, I full-heartedly agree, right? And again, I think one of the things that's been really interesting about this journey with Dolby is, again, they started using our talent acquisition product. They started then using our talent management product. And then they now are using us for Talent Flex. And what it enables the organization to do is break down those silos, right? So, no longer is, the contingent person only focused on, that, but really about helping the ecosystem of Dolby really improve your talent base, whether it's full-time, whether it's an existing employee, or whether it's a contractor that you bring on. And I think the example that Alan was referring to in some of our earlier discussions and some of the conversations I've had in my prior life is, how do you use this as part of your ongoing strategy, or part of your ongoing total talent strategy? Can you, again, GE is the example I use, but GE struggles in finding data scientists, right? Well-recognized brand in the in the world, but not the sexiest place to work for a data scientist. And so, the idea that they could bring on a great data scientist, then use their full-time, hire a data analyst, and pair those two together and really sort of upskill them, is sort of the ability when you have a single platform that gives you all of those opportunities to look at.
I think it's a really good point too, because it's one where, while I hope our brand is great, there's a lot of other good companies out there. It's foolish to think that we have the best employees working for us. In that same vein of with GE and data, is the same thing for us of like, hey, maybe this rock star marketing person doesn't want to be a full-time employee for us, but maybe they want to help with a branding initiative with The Weeknd and Justin Bieber, and to be on a special project with us. And that's the ticket that gets us greater talent than the person that doesn't want to be full-time with us, right?
Yeah, no, not Justin Bieber for me, but maybe someone else. But yeah, again, I think that's the interesting thing, right? It's about developing a relationship. It's about really using this notion of candidate relationship management. How do you start it today in full-time, over into contingent, maybe as an employee, go back and forth. I've always been of this idea, and again, it's in our logo, this infinite loop of how do you have people come in, touch your organization, add value, bring a set of skill sets, develop themselves, and then really move on to the next thing. I mean, the days have passed where you work at one organization for 30 years, right? But most of the Gen Z folks, most of the millennials I talk to want to do things in a very short-term capacity, develop their skills, and then go move into a different industry, different vertical, different area so that they can continue to grow. And then at some point they may want to then just come in and spend 5 years at Dolby, right? And grow their career there. So thoughts on some of the ideas around candidate experience?
Yeah. I think that's a big one, right? Because it's one where there are technically platforms out there that can provide you certain things. You don't get the full control if you actually control it yourself from a direct sourcing standpoint. So it's one where we can actually control the full flow. It's like, hey, what's our outreach initiative? Or hey, how are we re-engaging folks that maybe they applied into it? And I think also the Eightfold AI piece of it, it's one where it's always constantly updating our prior database of like, hey, maybe this person might have changed a different career trajectory and that maybe it's not that silver medalist, maybe it was that 99th person that technically grew their career. And if you sort of re-engage them again, it'll be very interesting. You'll be like, oh wow, Dolby reached back out to me. You might then be more interested to go buy our product or to go to a Dolby cinema again. So the brand and candidate experience piece of it really goes together quite a bit, in my opinion, from an engagement standpoint too, and just from a brand perspective out there, people talk.
I think this is an interesting notion, and I remember one of the first conversations with Nick and Alan was that even our talent strategy is not simply focused on hiring someone for that immediate need, but really developing a relationship, right? I think this is the thing that we often forget, right? Dolby is a consumer brand that brings products to market, right? And so leaving an awful taste in anyone's mouth because they were, not the finalist or not the one that was hired, can be a very negative experience. And I think that what you guys are really thinking about, what you're doing, adds a ton of value.
Yeah. No, I completely agree on that piece of it. And it's one where we want to be able to have folks leave with a good, so to say, taste in their mouth or just a good feeling or a perspective about Dolby and to be able to re-engage on it at some point in the future, right? It'd be great if they, buy the product, but also in general, if they talk to other people, they can just say like, oh, it's a good product and brand feel in general.
So I think one of the earliest conversations I had with you guys was, right, and I think this is the challenge with sort of the shift from an HR sort of landscape to a what typically is done by procurement folks. Is how do you run these programs? How do you leverage your MSPs? How do you use your VMSs to sort of provide up these things? But you guys were really focused on this talent lens. Like, how do I add that to the equation? I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your thoughts, why that's so important to drive the right candidate experience.
I think it's very important just because I've sat in organizations where my program was in procurement or my program was in HR from a people perspective. I think where it sits in an organization can really lend into like, hey, do I treat people like dollars or do I treat people like people? And for me, I think it's actually, both are fine. I've worked in both, but I think in general, you do need to be into the element that, hey, even though they're not your core full-time staff, you do want to make sure that there's a good impression that's left. You do want to make sure that while you have these people, they do great work for you. And I think from that element of it, it's one like, hey, you want to get away from like the worlds of like, I don't want to keep naming names, but like certain companies are always in the news about their contingent labor programs and how they're ill-treated and all these type of things too, right? So it's one where if you're, dealing with people and knowing that you're dealing with people and not just dollars and throwaway resources, it's really big on that piece of it to be like, hey, lending into that one of, treating it correctly from the whole process.
Yeah, we won't go into red badge, blue badge. Yeah. But again, I think this brings another sort of interesting topic, right? And I think this is how sort of our journey started was the old way of doing things, right? Staffing up a bunch of folks to maybe do a direct sourcing program or leveraging an MSP that's got a bunch of these other things. Was not the approach that Dolby wanted to take. They wanted to leverage the AI, they wanted to leverage the automation, they wanted to leverage the candidate relationship management aspect of it. And I think that that's a fundamental shift from the traditional way of thinking about it. But again, any thoughts on some of that initial journey, especially as you guys are going around now talking to internal customers, internal stakeholders to really drive traffic to this?
Yeah, there's a lot of energy around it just because, we really think that we're going to be able to build talent pools that we can be able to re-leverage. It's one where, if all the predictors are right, 50% of the workforce by 2030 will be freelancing or gig, right? So by default, you're not going to be able to hire full-time employees at the right clip at a future date.
Yeah.
So I think in general, when you're leveraging these type of things and being strategic about it, because same thing that you mentioned, the archaic ones, what works today shouldn't work as well 5 years from now. And if you're using the same toolkit that you had 5 years from now, you're not really moving the needle forward from there, right? So that's
very, very much so, right? And I think the other thing is right, leveraging data to really make informed decisions. So, again, I'll raise a different customer that we were talking about the same sort of thing, but I'd love any of your insights after place this out there. One of the individuals we were talking to, they were trying to figure out their talent sourcing strategy, right, on the contingent side of things. And they were trying to open a new animation office in Singapore. And one of the interesting things to me, we were in these conversations. I said, well, what tells you that Singapore is the right place to hire a bunch of Maya engineers? And they said, well, again, it's based on cost, it's based on these other things. We feel that our suppliers have told us that they can find people there. I said, well, look, let's use the jobs intelligence engines that Eightfold has built. Let's, see truly if there are that skill set that exists there. We piped in Maya into it. We saw that, it was San Diego, LA, San Francisco, and Bangalore. I said, look, you could spend 12 months hoping that your suppliers will come through with the right talent that know how to spell Maya and then actually know what to do with it. But again, in that respect, I think that's the way that you guys have been taking this approach, right? It's how do I use data to inform where I open up offices, where I staff these things, instead of a singular approach to them.
Yeah, it's a very true statement. We've opened 2 offices since we've been talking to you guys, and we use that exact approach. It's hey, where's the talent going, or where's the shift happening from there too, right? Of that piece, and also just being cognizant you have a global workforce, and to be able to get ahead of that piece of it. And
and again, I think it just goes to highlight, right, that going and looking at your talent pool, surfacing the right types of talent, is a game-changing way to really take the approach of staffing your contract business, right? And as organizations are going from 10, 20, 30, 50%, it cannot be a neglected part of your group. And again, I know we're sitting in a room of HR professionals on the talent side of things. And next week there's the one talking to procurement buyers, but I think that the worlds are starting to converge. Yeah. And so let me touch on that for a little bit, right? How have you bridged the gap with your procurement folks? Or is it a journey?
I think it's a journey, right? It's one where, like I said, depending on if you're looking too much into dollars and cents, you should be looking at it more strategically as to, hey, if I put in this investment now, will lead to greater trends, down the line from there, right? And I think also and this sort of teeters away from what you're asking, potentially, but it's one of hey, is this something that makes sense from the investment piece of it, of, maybe we don't hire full-time employees, maybe we take a bet initially with Elastic or with Flex, do we really want to ramp up cloud engineering, or do we want to hire people externally that have done this forever? What's the knowledge outside of Dolby that we could bring in from external resources, and to be able to control it a bit more with,
I love that, right? So using contractors to upskill the rest of the organization, start to really develop that ability with your existing employees and providing them the right potential of, ironically, mentorship that comes from contingent labor, right? That really sort of takes it to the next level. One thing that really stood out in the last few months of conversations with you guys is how invested you guys are in this approach, because I think you guys are doing your fiscal planning, and traditionally fiscal planning was how do I take my current headcount, look at the revenue numbers, and say, okay, I want to be 1x, 2x, and in a great economy 3x, right? Yeah. But I think you guys have inserted yourself into the conversation in a very different way. Yeah. Any thoughts there to add?
Yeah, in general, my greater org is work innovation, right? And to the same lens, we want to be able to think about it of, traditionally, you have a head count, you try to bake in all these things that this person can potentially do that'll take you 6 months plus to find someone, and some of the stuff you wanted, they don't even want to do in the first place anymore. It's one where what we try to do is like, how can we sort of deconstruct the work a bit more? How can we sort of think more strategically as to like, hey, this is the core things that we need, and these are auxiliary, and maybe can we turn some of these other parts into a center of excellence or something of that nature. So it's really about unpacking, what is the core thing that we're looking for, where does that talent actually live and exist, and ultimately, how do we empower Dolby's core employees to do its most impactful work? And where is there an opportunity to maybe leverage outside or external resources to move the other piece of it, right? Core versus periphery. Core is our Dolby work. What are some of the periphery things that we can leverage external, which can become core at some point?
Yeah, no, I think that makes tremendous sense because again, look at the economy we're currently in, right? Yeah. We're every day we're either headed into a recession, coming out of a recession, right? So don't know where we're going with this. Like in my mind, when I think about this from a talent perspective, you need to have utmost flexibility, right? Yeah. And I think most people in COVID did not have that flexibility. They didn't know what to do, panicked, went to layoffs. Then, 2021, it was hire everyone back and then some because we need to, do this. And I think the smart approach that Dolby kept coming to us was, how do I lever up and lever down as needed, right? And, and I think it goes back to that tenet, right? What is core to Dolby, and then where do I go with this? Yeah. And so, as you look forward, what are some of the biggest opportunities for you guys to leverage the Talent Flex product to help you do some of those things?
I think an inadvertent thing that it's going to end up happening is in most organizations, teams don't talk to each other. It's one where you might have a core marketing team, but you actually will have additional pockets of quote marketing based on product and vertical and all that type of stuff. Even with when I first came here, I was like, why is there so many different audio test things that are happening, and why would we not be talking like it from technical difficulty?
No worries. We got a little too excited about audio technical, and then the person pulled the mic, right?
Yeah, exactly. But from that piece of it, I think what's going to be really big is it's going to be able to create talent pools. It's one where I think with most organizations, you might have 10,000 openings. It's probably going to be like boiled down to like a very finite amount of actual core things. So what I think is going to be very interesting for Talent Flex is going to be able to tap into like, I need someone to do event or market branding or something like that. We can tap into people that we've already leveraged before and be able to re-engage them again in the future. And it's going to be able to build pools basically. So.
Yeah, the feedback loop, right? Someone worked 6 months, they worked out really well, they gained some new skills somewhere else, and then brought them back in to do it again. I think is fundamentally shifting the equation on the way that people operate. So one last thing that I'll close on before then, I want to leave it open for a couple minutes to questions, is sort of, you started to touch on this, right? I saw when I first came into the contingent space, this idea of silos. Hiring managers had their best favorite suppliers, right? It wasn't done in a program capacity. Even the program managers, never had full visibility into what was going on. I think that was one of the objectives that you guys had laid out was like, I want to know using data, the visibility across the board of what's going on, where are we hiring, where do we have pipeline, all that sort of thing. But any thoughts to add to that one?
I think it's one where we want to be able to look at it from a total talent management workflow, right? And it's one where with Eightfold, I think what's very interesting in that you guys are a part of our full talent ecosystem, and now with Talent Flex, we can sort of talk to each other both ways, which is very interesting. It almost creates like I don't want to say that, I wish I had better words, like a reseller channel basically of like, hey, this is a total ecosystem we can be able to tap in, re-leverage, and if there's gaps into it from there, we're actually talking to each other from a whole perspective, from a total HR and talent perspective.
Yeah, no, the total talent thing, right? The ability to abstract in and say, hey, look, I've got employees now that, if with the right upskilling could do the work. I've got full-time talent in a talent pool that potentially could do this, or I've got contingent talent now that I've got a talent pool to look at that can provide these things is definitely a different equation than it was, a year ago for you guys. So I want to leave it a couple minutes, I think, 5 minutes left. Leave it to the audience to bring us thoughts, questions, comments. Ryan.
Borrowing resources from TA or a bit of both?
It's a bit of both on that side of it. I think what Eightfold does is actually automates a lot of the pieces of that flow. You do want to make sure you do have that candidate experience touch point from there, which I already have with any actual core team. You should have team members that are from a talent background, all that type of piece of it. But from that piece of it, Eightfold's been good in that there's a lot of automations when it comes to outreaches, comes to branding, and all those type of things from there. We can do some pre-screens in advance, which is very good. There are touch points. It is one where right now, just to get it off and from the full pilot, we're getting help from our recruiting team, but it's set up in a way that our team can fully manage and handle from there. So it's a bit of a team effort, but there's a lot better when it comes to cost savings, just because your suppliers can technically mark you up 50+%, whereas with us and with some of our partners, it's like, I don't want to give the pricing numbers, but it's, you know,
Preferential.
it's preferential. Because we're doing the legwork up front and we see these savings on the back end.
Was it hard to sell the vision of direct sourcing internally? Like how did you actually manage those conversations?
Yes. Well, I won't say, I'll say a broad one. I think it's typically hard to sell it. I think with my team and Dolby, it wasn't the hardest sell just because it is work innovation. But I think if you can sort of start to see what the benefits are with direct sourcing when it comes to better brand, better recognition, better end-to-end experience from it. I've done this at other places too with less stuff to work with. And I think a lot of it ends up being too of like, hey, you can sort of standardize, the assessment criteria to make sure that people are, quote unquote, Dolby qualified or whatever company you are qualified. So there's a lot of benefits on the back end that aren't blatantly upfront recognizable. So.
Awesome, makes sense.
Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think with us, it was one where luckily with Dolby, our function sat within people. So there wasn't like a big grudge match. In places that I've seen, like with procurement having that, how would you sort of position this to someone that was adverse from the procurement side? If you can show them that, hey, from a cost savings perspective, you can leverage, having internal people manage this, because instead of getting that 50% markup, you're getting it at a more preferential, I'll throw a broad range of 5 to 20%, 5 being if it's C2C, and there's some other plays into it, but there's a lot of indirect, or direct cost impacts that you could alleviate from there. That it depends on the persona, right, of like who you're trying to impress or be able to buy into it. So
wonderful. We got room for one more question. Okay, well, with no more questions, let me just leave them one last thing. Is there anything for the folks in the audience to walk away with on how to potentially start this conversation inside an organization?
I'd say from a walk, crawl, run perspective, I think it's one of, if you've been doing things one way for 5, 10 plus years, why aren't you looking or assessing different things? It's one where you'd be foolish not to at least make a look or an assessment into it. Talents changed, tools have changed, the world has changed. It's one, if you're not trying to tinker with things and trying to see what sticks and what doesn't, if you're not trying to re-engineer your processes, you're doing a detriment to yourself and your company in general, because most companies should be innovating. HR should be innovating, and that's 2 cents.
Couldn't agree with you more. Alan, thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful conversation. Again, audience, thank you for showing up. Have a good rest of your day.